Good morning. I'd like to welcome everyone to this session. My name is Heather Grady, and I'm the Vice President for Foundation Initiatives from the Rockefeller Foundation. Very nice to have you all here this morning. I just want to start with a few comments about the foundation. This is a very big week for us at the Rockefeller Foundation. We are doing our public launch of our centenary and our centennial celebrations day after tomorrow here in Washington, D.C. And the theme of our centennial is innovation for the next 100 years. So it's nice that this panel focuses on innovation. The theme of our event on Thursday is embracing change, building social, economic, and environmental resilience. And I think it's interesting because I think a lot of the themes that we talk about vis-a-vis resilience at the foundation have been brought up repeatedly today already and yesterday. I also just want to say that I think that the history of our foundation over the last 99 years has been very much about cross-sectoral collaboration. And I think, again, I think what this Global Philanthropy Forum is doing in bringing together people from across a wide range of sectors, and this year more than ever, I think many different countries, is really important, and it's something that we've always emphasized. I'm sure you know a bit about us. We just more recently, in the last decade or so, launched the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, and that again is a strong partnership between governments, the private sector, and civil society, and impact investing, which of course was the topic of our last panel just now, but fields like that where we really see the benefits of partnership. So I want to introduce our fantastic panelists. First, I'll start immediately to my left is Nyaradzayi Gumbonzvanda. She is a human rights lawyer, originally from Zimbabwe, and she's been the World YWCA General Secretary since 2007. And I first met Nyaradzayi in my last job when I worked with Mary Robinson at an organization called Realizing Rights. Mary said to me, "Nyaradzayi is one of my great heroes, and she only has a handful." So I said, I have to meet this woman. And wherever she goes, she really catalyzes fantastic discussions. The World YWCA movement extends across 108 countries with a reach of 25 million women and girls, and their priorities include women's intergenerational leadership, sexual and reproductive health and rights, violence against women, and economic empowerment. So this is not your grandmother's YWCA. Jennifer Barsky is the Partnerships Coordinator at the International Finance Corporation, the IFC, the private sector arm of the World Bank Group. In this capacity, she manages global partnership development with corporate and private philanthropies. She's also IFC's relationship manager for U.S., Spanish, and Portuguese development agencies, and has advised IFC's clients on developing community-based foundations as part of their strategic community investments. And it's been a real pleasure for me to get to know Jennifer better in the last year. Our third speaker, Sigrid Kach, could not be with us today. She had some special something to do, or was called away by her boss. So instead we have Romesh Muttukumaru. He's the Deputy Assistant Administrator at UNDP at the Partnerships Bureau. He's been in UNDP for 27 years, so if anyone knows it, he does. He began in the Division of Finance and then moved to the United Nations Volunteers and then back to UNDP headquarters. In 2004, Romesh was appointed as Special Advisor attached to the Partnerships Bureau for specific UNDP initiatives on UN reform and supporting the overall coordination of these initiatives within the organization. And he's originally from Sri Lanka. So this session has a chapeau on the theme of innovation. So all of the sessions taking place now. And within that, of course, our special emphasis is how can we collaborate to maximize comparative advantage? This is very critical to building the new social contract that we've been talking about here, both within countries and communities and also internationally. One reason why our three institutions have come together as panelists here is because we were together last November at something called the Bellagio Initiative on the Future of Philanthropy and Development in the Pursuit of Human Well-Being. And this is something that we had at the Rockefeller Foundation's Bellagio Center in Italy. That effort, which was led by my colleague Rob Garris, who's here in the front row, was really about taking two distinct disciplines or communities, philanthropy and development, and seeing where were there overlaps in intention, in goals, in outcomes, and where were there differences, and how could we really make the most of bringing those two communities together. And Romesh was not there. His colleague Nyaradzayi was there from their Geneva office. But I think that Jennifer and Nyaradzayi and many others made fantastic contributions. So we just wanted to bring forward some of the discussions. And I know, Rob, you mentioned that yesterday the Bellagio initiative was brought up. And I think if anyone's interested, you can go on the website and get more details. We had some interesting conclusions coming out of that and commitments. One of them, for example, was the whole idea of building shared platforms for collecting, analyzing, and acting on data, because that's often, there are some institutions that really are fantastic at data gathering and others who don't do that at all. How can we do that better? Creating a center of excellence that's a training center and repository for philanthropic organizations, and exploring innovative ways to effectively find, support, and scale innovations that improve well-being, including looking at value chains. How can there be user-centered innovation in global value chains? So that's the bulk of what I'm going to talk about. I want to turn to our panelists and get really dig into some of their ideas. I'm going to start by asking each of you a double question. Tell us about something that's at the top of your agenda right now in your institution that embraces collaborating with other sectors. And Jennifer and Nyaradzayi, if while you're, as part of the answer to that question, feel free as well to weave in any of your takeaways from the Bellagio initiative, from the convening we had in November. That, as I said, that like this is really bringing together people from a diverse array of institutions. So I'd like to ask the three of you to kick off. Nyaradzayi, maybe you go first.
Good morning. I just want to invite you to Life in the Village in Africa, which is going to be the premise of my sharing this afternoon, this morning, still morning. On what is on the top of our agenda is the YWCA, and to use the Africa as an example, but it's a global perspective. First, we are really focused on securing rights and dignity of women and girls intergenerationally as the main focus. And within that, a very significant conversation on the issues of sexual and reproductive health and rights for young women, especially those living with HIV, where we have the nexus of poverty, of exclusion, of violence against women, and also of possibilities, because within that nexus is also possibilities. The collaboration that we have, and I want to give an example of our work in Zambia with the YWCA in Zambia, where we're saying, for us to address this issue, we want to address, we really want to reduce the preventable deaths that we have of women on the African continent and elsewhere. The issue of maternal mortality, we know it's preventable, we know it's unacceptable, we know it's the least MDG that we have seen progress. And we know by addressing the issues of reproductive health for young women, we can make a dent. And by addressing the issues of reproductive health for young women, we can address the issue of early marriage, forced marriage for our little girls who are supposed to be in class, and we can also be addressing the issues of teenage pregnancy. And by investing in young women, we're saying we need to invest in access to services, quality, affordable, accessible services from the demand side, for provision of safe spaces where women intergenerationally can come together to discuss crucial, critical conversations, some of those things which you cannot say in a workshop, like when your father rapes you, you cannot say that in a workshop. You need a critical space, safe space to have those discussions, to discuss and offer opportunities for building assets for young women and especially for girls, where they are not just beneficiaries and victims, but for us to translate this experience of young women to be champions and advocates and innovators and enablers in terms of behavior change, in terms of policy change, in terms of access, and in terms of questioning the accountability that is needed. And for us to do this, we know it's a huge challenge, but it's exciting because it's every girl it's possible to offer that opportunity with services. We have gone into a very creative relationship collaboration with many partners. We have the World YWCA Power to Change Fund. This is a small grant making that we do from the YWCA internally. And we looked at the Power to Change Fund, which was established by contributions of individuals into this fund. We combined that with volunteer contribution. Men and women in the community contribute their time and their talents, may not contribute some shillings, but they contribute through volunteer time as a contribution to this collaboration, which we value and we treasure. We work closely with the government of Zambia, just remaining the Zambia experience, where we have referrals with the Minister of Education, the Minister of Health, the police, as an established relationship with the government, because there are certain issues which we cannot handle as the YWCA, and we need to do the cross-referral. A clear referral support system and mechanism. From the funding point of view, we entered into a relationship with the Packard Foundation, where the Packard Foundation provided a matching grant to the resources of the YWCA. And the same YWCA in Zambia, we've been able to get funding from the UN through the Violence Against Women Trust Fund. For me, this is an example of how communities' contribution is valued, there is scale up, and there is impact. And with this program, we are in 8 countries in Africa on the sexual and reproductive health and rights for young women. We are in 8 countries in Africa, and we're looking at how we can expand that program to be more than 8 countries in Africa. We are also looking at how it's not sufficient. It's not sufficient to just support this one girl in the village to go to have opportunities. It's critical that we also engage in policy advocacy, because we need a sustainable change to happen. But that policy advocacy at the national level should include 3 dimensions: the actual legislation or law or regulation, budget and resource allocation, and creative partnerships. We're discussing with Mr. Mwangi on public-private sector partnership, so that these young women are also can have decent jobs, can have income, can have possibilities. The last is the global. Whatever happens in my village is also informed by global policies. And for us in the YWCA, as part of the strategic relationship and collaborative partnership, is to engage in the global policy-making space and arena, so that the policies and frameworks, whether by the World Bank, whether by the United Nations, at whatever level, at the global level, those policies impact what happens in the village. Whether we are talking about e-governance, those issues around control or liberation of technology, which is discussed at the global level, impacts mobile telephony and e-health in my village. So the whole link of collaboration across levels, collaboration across sectors, but at the center of it, to position the leadership, the voice, the possibilities of young women, and to look at intergenerational leadership as a perspective. Lastly, whatever we may do, it's about dignity. However we may name it, it's about rights. However we may shape it, it's about unleashing the potential within each one of us in our communities. And this is why I feel this space has been an empowering space for me to be in this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. You really got us off to a good start. Jennifer.
And I'm supposed to follow that. So I'm going to try and inspire you from a completely different perspective, because from our village. So I work at a bureaucracy down the street. But my inspiration comes from the aspects of scale, because no matter where I turn inside the organization that I work with, which is the International Finance Corporation, and then as part of that group, the World Bank as a whole. And so nowhere do we have access, in my view, to that level of scale across sectors, across regions. And at the heart of IFC really is partnership, because if you think about our history, we were started in 1956 to really demonstrate that you could do private investment in developing countries, in countries that were going through reconstruction. And over time, that evolved. We now have 183 shareholder countries, and we are the largest multilateral focused on private sector development. And when I think about private sector development and when we focus on private sector development, we're addressing a lot of the issues raised around access, around economic empowerment. I used to run Nike's foundation, and as we know, when a girl doesn't have a penny in her pocket, she doesn't have a lot of choices. So the issue about job creation, about giving people economic opportunity is really the area that we focus on, as well as the whole question of economic growth. How do we bring significant scale of financing to governments so that they can also be effective providers of goods and services to their people? So, I mean, if I think about that partnership, it really is about how do we bridge that gap between those that have the catalytic financing, have the flexibility, who don't have 183 shareholders who are meeting regularly throughout the week on every project that we do, to really take where the innovation and the flexibility is coming from and bring that into the bigger development picture. And this was certainly a takeaway for me from Bellagio, is how do we get to the same language? So when we talk about catalytic investment, when we talk about leverage, how do we bring the partnership between the World Bank Group and those at the UN, where we can get that scale of 2.2 billion investments in Africa alone in the case of IFC, to meet on the ground where it matters with those who may have access to the different networks, who have the capacity to be at the village level, so that we can almost serve as that intermediation. And so, I mean, if I look at why private sector development matters so much, IFC provided 1.1 million people access to sustainable farming opportunities. We provide health and education to over 2 million people around the world. We provided access to finance to almost 23 million people around the globe. And our work with micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises, we were able to give financing of over $24 billion. So we have, that was in 2011 alone. So when I think about scale, I'm thinking about that level. And some of the, I think, you know, you asked what's top of mind for us. It is, how do we actually get on the same page? And what we're increasingly finding is, even within our own work, we have investments on one side and we have advice and training and problem solving on the other. And interestingly, I often find colleagues on my advisory side who don't talk to my investment side, and my investment side who's not talking to my advisory side. So even the big push inside IFC today is to be one IFC, to leverage our own internal assets across the more than 100 offices, across the incredible level of expertise and experience that we bring. And donors, when I say donors, I mean country donors, are also starting to think about bridging that gap between technical assistance, investment, and concessional finance, which is a lot of the way we think about impact investing, I think. It's that, what's the concessional term that's going to trigger? How can we give investment that's going to be a little bit less demanding, let's say, at the outset, when people really need financing to get things going? And if you heard Tony Alumelu was a client. IFC supported UBA when it went Pan-African. And his critique to us was, even we were not long enough term thinkers. And he had to really push us to go out beyond 5 years, because that's what it takes to really make this stuff happen. So our donors are increasingly beginning to understand this, and they're looking to provide us funding that is not just grants, but also concessional finance to be able to support investments in areas that are not the easiest to do. And I'll talk a little bit about what I think is happening in health and education. But it's not easy to make investments in the health sector, in the agri sector. How do you effectively reach small-scale holders at scale? So we have a relationship with the Canadian government who provided us $100 million to do clean technology on a concessional finance. So this is a really new area, even for governments to be entering into. So I think the Bellagio dialogue was a perfect time to really think about the sustainability and also the metrics. How do we start thinking along the same terms of what we're looking for in terms of returns? What are the financial returns we're looking for? What are the social returns? And then how do we come together to create a balance between those who might be looking for more social versus more commercial versus, and start to get this capital moving in a way that is really supporting the enterprises on the ground who are either going to be the banks, like Tony Alumelu was talking about, who are going to create financial inclusion at that level, or the bottom of the pyramid solutions, and that are really providing the access to goods and services, or the innovative technologies that are going to bring education, health, or lighting, or whatever the particular need is to the places that need it most. So I'm most excited because I think even if you had the opportunity to hear Mr. Zelik speak, one of the takeaways that a lot of people came up to me after and said was, it was long. But what I took away was that the bank is becoming more accessible. Mm-hmm. And I think that's having myself here, having my director is here, having other people from inside the multilaterals and the UN system, making it accessible, bringing you in and bringing us out is going to have a really significant impact going forward.
Thanks, Jennifer. Romesh, what's top of the agenda at UNDP right now?
Now I have two tough acts to follow. Let me first start as my colleague out there from YWCA said, it takes a village, I guess. But let me go up to say it takes a village, and then it goes to the local level, then it goes to the national level, then it goes to the regional level, and I go up to the global level. And let me start with the UN. So first, very clearly, is that before I get into what we are so much absorbed about right now in UNDP, to just say that something that is self-evident to all of you, we are in a crossroads right now in the global mix of challenges that we are facing. You all know that. We're in a multipolar world. We have economic problems, we have social problems, and we have environmental issues to challenge. And if you look at it, while you ultimately, when the rubber hits the road, it is the local solutions that are absolutely crucial. But at the end of the day, you need to get those local solutions influenced at the national level. You need regulatory environment, you need laws, you need institutions, you need good governance, and it all then translates from the local to the national to the regional to the global. So if you look at multilateral institutions, in a sense today in a multipolar world, we really need strong multilateral institutions in a multipolar world. Now we know that you take an organization like the UN and you have 192 countries in it, and just imagine when we look at our own parliaments or Congress and we find it difficult for them to operate, and how do you see the UN operating? And we all come with different cultures, different rules of the game, different ways of thinking, and we are still trying to manage, and we still somehow or the other plod along and find a way to succeed. So just to focus right now, just to say, yes, I want to, as I try to focus on some key issues that we need to address right now, and what we are focusing on, that the UN needs reform. And reform is not going to only happen by governments. And if you leave governments to just to reform, it's never going to, we are not going to get that solution. you need other partnerships. You need civil society, you need the private sector, you need philanthropic sector, which is now growing, and you need various other actors to push and plot governments at the national level, at the local level, at regional level. We are getting very much intertwined at the subnational level, where it's beginning to influence the national level. Because if you leave it just to governments at the national level to come and make their case at the global level, it's not going to happen if you do not bring other actors into the fore. So let me just sort of focus right now on what is out there, which is the big issue of today and what we are focusing on. One is Rio Plus 20 and the post-2015 agenda, which we are heavily focusing and getting ready for June. UNDP is playing a very central role with the Brazilians and with others in preparing for the conference. To say, I think the most important part of the agenda is to get people to understand, and the global context and global population understand, that the Rio meeting is not just about environment. Sustainable development does not mean just environment. That it includes, and it is imperative that when you're dealing with sustainable development, you have three strands, which is the social side, the economic side, and the environment side. They are intrinsic to one another, they're intertwined. We change it from pillars to strands, because pillars stand straight, strands you can intertwine. And it's absolutely crucial that we look at them and we work with them in that context. So what are we in UNDP trying to do is, one is that we're engaging at the country level in getting at the different, we work, let me just say first to backtrack, we work in 177 countries in UNDP. We have full-fledged country offices in about 130 of them. Otherwise, we have programs and projects offices in the other countries. We are today a 5 billion organization. We are voluntary funded. We are not assessed. We are voluntary funded. So we are bottom line organization. So if we don't do a good job, you don't give us money. The governments don't get us money, and we don't get it. So in a sense, we have to perform like any bottom line organization to get our resources. What we do is that we're trying to engage our level best at the country level, especially in the developing countries, for them to understand that development means that you cannot just focus in one area. You need to package your development and your national priorities and your national development plans linked to environment, linked to social reform, and linked to the economic reform too in your own countries. Very clear is, I think, the biggest challenge we're having is the whole subject of green economy. Everyone is challenged as to what green economy means. And let me just tell you as an anecdote, today you have an outcome document which is being negotiated at the UN. It's over 200 plus pages, and they're still trying to define in that document, because you have 192 countries trying to now define what this document is going to be and what's going to come out of Rio. And there are many definitions of what green economy is. Some take it as full-fledged just environment, and to think that it's conditionality. In the other group feels that that the North is putting a conditionality, that future development can only take place with new technologies, and that you can do it. And the developing countries also feel that you're going to put trade constraints, that if you do not sort of adhere to a new form of economic development, that it changes in a sense. So there is a whole dynamic that is going on as what do you mean by a green economy, and what needs to move forward in terms of defining what that green economy is. And in that context, we again in UNDP are helping countries to understand what it means in this context, that you need to be, when you get into the new form of development, you need to look at environmental factors. You need to look at the social factors of poverty alleviation. You need to look at the grassroots level, how are you getting basic needs, whether it's food, water, shelter, how are you doing that? This all needs to come in. Then at the end of the day, you need good governance in terms of where we're going. Very important in this context is just that when UNDP works in a sense at the global level, we are influencing at the national level how countries bring up their own views into the global agendas, and get them to understand what it means is that if you do not sort of influence at the global agendas, you lose out in that development context. Let me just give you a couple of examples of how we are working. UNDP focuses on a couple of areas. We focus in the whole area of governance. And when I talk about governance, it doesn't mean just about democratic reform and elections. It talks about building institutional capacity. Because if you talk about at a national level, if you do not have the good civil service, for example, how are you going to perform your services at the country level? If you do not have proper legal frameworks to, whether it's institutions to look after human rights, or if it's or different forms of regulatory frameworks to encourage entrepreneurship, for example, if you want to create conditions for entrepreneurship, you need to have the right institutions, you need to have the right regulatory framework and the right institutions. So UNDP focuses on that. Then we go on to the whole poverty environmental nexus. And that's where we focus on poverty alleviation programs, but looking at how environment plays a key role. And that's where I mentioned about the green economy and how you look at new technologies and how you can bring in new technologies without it being too expensive initially. There are clean ways of looking at development and how you can work and how you influence that. There we are engaging very much with the private sector, and we are bringing the private sector into bear. For example, in this, in different countries, we have been looking at how do you bring in the private sector in and engaging the civil society, as well as bringing in the philanthropic sector into that equation. One other key area which we are focusing on as UNDP is the whole issue of crisis prevention and recovery. What does it mean on crisis prevention and recovery? We put in a lot of effort in developing a country. Let's say we put in a lot of money in developing a country. You bring the country up to speed. Tomorrow you have a coup, or you have a national disaster, or you have some catastrophe. You don't want all the institutions that you have built completely collapsing. What we are attempting to do in UNDP is how do you prop up institutions before they completely collapse? How do you support governments and how do you support at the country level structures so that do not collapse, so that you have to reinvest completely again? So that's the form that we take in terms of prioritizing on crisis prevention. And when it comes to the recovery, of course, it's inevitable you are going to have crisis situations that you need to work with. And that's how we don't get into the humanitarian side, which other parts of the UN and other NGOs get into. We support other parts of the bilateral system. We support other NGOs. We work very closely with civil society. But how we help them is helping them to rebuild in terms of, again, coming back to our governance portfolio, etc. So let me just, to sort of end on a note, is that we are, as a multilateral system, I think everyone sees the UN as this big machinery. And in a sense, and I think as Christine mentioned, we are trying to put a face to the UN, okay, like any other multilateral institution. The UN cannot work by itself. It's imperative that in the new development paradigm that is coming out there, that the UN has to work together with civil society, which is going to be absolutely crucial, because it is the global population and how civil society sort of really mobilizes itself, and the UN has to give more and more of a voice to the civil society, because we are working as UNDP on people-centered development. Our focus is people-centered development. In UNDP, we focus on human development. That's the way, and I think most of you are familiar with our human development reports. We see that measuring just with GNI or GDP is not the answer. You need to look at beyond GNI, GDP. The Human Development Index takes into account access to health, access to education, looking at rights issues. So you need to go much broader in terms of how we measure, and we need to, this debate is on there. And in that sense, I think the face of the UN has to change. We need to engage the private sector. Private sector itself is changing. We had this, the CSR, which is the corporate social responsibility. Now you see the corporate sector looking at sustainable development business models, and that is changing. Reporting on financial from companies are changing, because they are trying to look at how they sort of respond to communities, to the environment. The UN has played a key role in influencing companies through the Global Compact, etc. So I just want to say there is this human face as we see the bank putting and the multilateral organizations putting. My last point just to say is that, there is a tendency today that all countries are facing a lot of problems on their own. There is that sense to look at introverted because you're trying to, like anyone else, trying to look at your own problems. There is a danger if you do that because while, yes, we need to address country-level problems and country-level solutions, but if we do not invest in the broader issue at a global level, at a regional level, we are going to face a much greater challenge if we do not do that. And here I stand is that I think the UN is the global organization you have today. I think we need to invest in it. It's got its weaknesses, it's got its flaws. It needs to be reformed and it continues to change. But I see it having more and more of a human face. Thank you.
Thank you, Romesh. Jennifer, I want to ask you one more question. And I'm going to use the definition of innovation that we use at the Rockefeller Foundation. I think a lot of others use this. Solving, let's say, a social process that is solving problems in new ways that's discontinuous from previous practice. So the last time I spoke with you, you said something like, partnership is a very different mindset, and you know immediately who gets it and who doesn't. It sounded like you weren't going to waste your time with people who you didn't sense in the first few seconds or minutes was into it. Tell us about something where there has been an example of where the IFC has done something that's truly discontinuous and that really, where you sense there was an opportunity for partnership that really looked at the comparative advantages of different sectors.
Thank you. That's quite a definition. So when Heather and I were talking about this session, that was definitely something that I think a lot about is the whole issue of partnership versus client versus relationship versus grantee versus, I think for me, having worked for UNDP, having worked inside private companies, having worked with the bank, having worked with IFC, you really do have to, especially inside large organizations like ours, find the people inside the system who you know are going to get it. Because not everybody's going to get it. They're going to come maybe with something that they already have that they say, hey, we've got this great solution. Can you go out and find somebody who's going to fund it? That's not a partnership. A partnership, I think, in the way that we think about it, is much more around, we have this serious challenge that we are not going to be able to solve on our own. And we need to bring other assets, other comparative advantage, other network, other types of funding to come together and bridge this so that we can really come up with an effective solution or take something to the next level in the case of an innovation. And so when I think about some of the examples of where I think we've really done this effectively is, one is the Health in Africa initiative that we worked on with the Gates Foundation. And as I mentioned before, it's really challenging to do successful investments in the private sector in Africa. So when one of our investment officers was tasked with increasing his portfolio, he knocked on Gates's door and he said, you have an interest in us growing our portfolio in this space, and we have an interest in knowing how to do it more effectively. And so Gates actually worked with us to think about a strategy, and that strategy led to a report about what is the role of the private sector in health in Africa. And we did this in 2007. And Africa is a very particular case because while you might only have 12% of the population, you have 26% of the disease burden. And the private sector, what we discovered, is tremendously engaged in solving that issue. And so the private sector, based on this report, we discovered is actually providing 50% of the health services in Africa and 60% of the funding to deliver health services. So you can either say, oh, health is the government's job, or you can say, well, here's a huge opportunity that we need to address because the private sector can help take some of that burden away while also helping to professionalize, create competition. And then we need the governments to understand how to effectively engage the private sector to ensure that they're not just serving either the middle or upper class. So we formed a partnership out of this together with the IFC, the World Bank, Rockefeller Foundation, Gates Foundation, and Elma Philanthropies, and we created what was really a programmatic approach to looking at this issue. So based on the findings of the report, we are working with government to build their capacity to engage and create the right legislative environment. We have a healthcare fund where we are looking for actual investments, and working with Gates, they helped us come up with some social metrics to incentivize the fund managers to not only be looking at financial returns, but also social returns. And then technical assistance to those companies to help make them successful and to help broaden their reach. So a really holistic program. And I think that type of experience for me really is what defines a partnership. Everybody came to the table with a different asset to bring, and the companies and the governments are also part of that equation because it's a learning curve for everybody. And I see Rita Roy in the room, and we have just forged a partnership with the MasterCard Foundation. And that, I mean, it took us over a year of real discussions to really come up with what is it that we want to do together that's going to leverage what we both bring to the table. And it's a partnership that we've forged around financial inclusion that leverages our greenfield microfinance. When IFC started working in Africa, when it came to commercial finance, we couldn't find a lot of partners. And so we really went out and we started microfinance institutions. And those microfinance institutions are now poised to scale. And so looking at those microfinance institutions, looking at the rise of mobile financial solutions to be able to broaden and deepen the reach, and then really drawing on a big learning component. What are we going to learn out of this that we can then bring to bear in the sector as a whole to help shape the future of commercial versus NGO-style microfinance that may not be as sustainable, but is having that depth of reach, the commercial where we are getting sustainability, but not necessarily the same reach, and really bring those mindsets together, leveraging our respective networks and our brands to go out and really talk about what we're learning and where we can make an impact. So to me, those are partnerships.
Thanks. Thanks very much. I think I'm going to open it up now. I hope everyone now has a very good foundational understanding of these three very different and complementary institutions. So I hope everyone can go to the microphone because we're recording this session. So if you have a question or a comment, can you just say your name and who you work for? And I think maybe we'll take 2 questions at a time. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. I'm Jessica Posner with Shining Hope for Communities. We're an organization in Nairobi. I actually have a question about collaboration and leadership and the role and need for women to play a greater role at the table. And so my question is, and sort of wanted your thoughts around, as we talk about collaboration and partnerships, it still seems that there is a need for more women to be in positions of real leadership at the table. So my question is, how do you make that happen, and how might that change how partnerships are existing and being formed in the space?
Does anyone have a question or comment related to that? If not, maybe I'll just ask Nyaradzayi. I'm going to ask you to take that one.
Thank you. This is a great question because the issues around leadership is about whose knowledge, whose perspective, whose point of view, whose experience is going to shape the what of a policy. And we know we have a deficit of women's involvement in decision making at this moment globally, whether this is about women is in the presidency of our countries. I know in Africa we are doing a little dance with Malawi now having a female president, but 2 out of 54. We were doing a little dance just by Ngozi putting herself up for position of the World Bank president, knowing that even the odds are out, but just asserting that possibility. We have some progress in Latin America, just at the presidency. We're looking at the elections in Kenya. We know there are women there who are running. Leadership has to start with the personal. In the YWCA, our mission is to develop the leadership of women and girls. As long as we don't invest in women making personal decisions in their lives, in their families, in their communities, it's very hard to have women in leadership in the corporate, in the boards, and at the national and public office. So we need that pre-investment stage of investing in leadership development, running a small group, being in a school, encouraging girls to take leadership positions in schools, in communities, asserting themselves. That is a very important part of developing the leadership. The second is the barriers. We still have so many barriers on women's leadership across the divide. For young women, very interesting work around young women that I do all my life. First, you are young, so the leadership is preferred for an older person, natural age experience. Second is young women, they say they are mobile. You're moving to a job elsewhere or getting married. Or so when we talk about leadership in communities, they're always asking, where do you belong? For instance, if I want to run for parliament, even myself, they would say, should I run where I'm married or where I'm born or where I live? That question does not arise for Charles, my husband. He can just run anywhere. But for a woman, your social status has implications in terms of choices of what options. So the social, cultural barriers for leadership exist. Thirdly is the issue of economic empowerment for women. As long as it's very difficult for women when you don't have assets like education as an asset, awareness, exposure, possibilities as an asset, means as an asset, it's very difficult for you to navigate into leadership. And therefore, for us, when we look at developing the leadership of women, we're also looking at addressing all these multiple barriers. But wherever there is a possibility, we celebrate. So we are, for instance, I heard that Lego Foundation has just appointed a female chief executive. I say, congratulations, that is really good. But ultimately, I think it's for all of us in whatever work we do, whether we are working on environment, on education, in business, to ask who is not on the table and why. If the women are not on the table, why are they not on the table? If the women with disabilities are not on the table, why are they not on the table? If we know why they are on the table, we can say, what can we do for them to be on the table? The impact on lack of women's participation has been huge. With HIV, we know that the whole Global Fund, the country mechanisms, there are very few women who access those decisions, and therefore very few access the resources. It's an issue of concern, and I'm glad that you've raised it, and that's why in the YWCA we're also putting a lot of effort to intergenerational leadership, to say we need an approach to leadership which is about intergenerational, which is not just investing on leadership for today, but also knowing that if you invest in the leadership of girls, adolescents, and young women today, they will be leaders for the next 40, 50 years. So that pre-investment in leadership today is significant. And that if we sustain the leadership of older women, they are also the wisdom to do the mentorship, the support, the advice. So an intergenerational approach enables us to also address the critical concern we hear in the Arab Spring, for instance, to say the young people started the revolution or were catalysts of the revolution. But when things are settled, the young people are no longer on the table. So that aspect of pushing in and pushing out of young people is a concern that we have, and we need to continue to leverage space, opportunities, capacities, and choices for women to be able to be in decision-making and to influence issues that affect their lives.
Thank you, Nyaradzayi. As usual, that was a very complete answer and touched on a lot of dimensions. I don't know if Jennifer or Romesh, you have anything to add very quickly.
Just to add, first as a side comment, our administrator and our associate administrator are both women.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Just to say is that one is very clear is in all the work UNDP does, the whole gender issue and women in terms, that aspect of it cuts across in everything that we do. It's absolutely crucial for the reasons you just also mentioned. And I just give you, and I think I just thought I'd give you a small example of what we're doing with the IKEA Foundation, is that in India, IKEA does a lot of business in terms of manufacturing, just a lot of some of their, how would you say, making carpets, let's say, in Uttar Pradesh, in a part of India. And a lot of women work in this area, but they live under very squalid conditions. And also, as you know, experience has shown that if you give women the opportunity to have access to finance, access to entrepreneurship, they can really alleviate poverty. In villages at the local level, women play such a major role in families that they can sort of really play that significant role within that community. So what we have done with IKEA is that we are training women to have knowledge to be entrepreneurs, giving them basic financial knowledge. And as of now, our target, and it's estimated that by the end of 2013, we'll have 50,000 women who would have been trained and who would have already begun small-scale enterprises on their own. And at the same time, being able to access micro-capital grants, etc. And this will have a sort of a rippling effect and a multiplier effect. Thanks. Okay.
Anything to add on that?
I'm just going to add something very brief because I want to hear some more questions from the audience. But, I mean, if you look at the World Bank, 2 out of the 3 managing directors currently are women. And I'm going to throw this out to Anita, who is the director at IFC for Partnerships and Advisory Services Operations. And there was a quiz that we recently had of how many VPs inside IFC are women. And I'm trying to think if she might remember the number. 50% of our VPs, including the head of advisory services. And gender is a strategic pillar within IFC. And I would put out a call for a partnership on our Women in Business program, which is making great strides in working with financial institutions to get them to understand how you create women business leaders in the community and how you can really build their capacity both to be successful entrepreneurs but also to access financing. Because as we move people through the chain of economic growth that Mr. Alumelu was talking about, women are consistently coming up with barriers, and IFC has made it really a priority to ensure that we are supporting their growth as well.
I would just add 2 things that the Rockefeller Foundation is doing. One is the World Bank report last year was on gender, and we have funded a companion report that's going to bring together the data collected by top-notch researchers across the world. So it's a partnership between the foundation and the World Bank, and that will be coming out in a couple of months on really what progresses gender in societies across the world. And the other one is a partnership we have with UN Women, which I think is one of the earliest ones for this very important UN agency. But I think a lot of us are exploring different ways to partner with the different multilateral institutions. Okay, another question. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you. My name is Kasha. I'm here from the Touch Foundation. We work in Tanzania training healthcare workers. But actually, before joining the Touch Foundation, I spent 3 months with the UNDP program in India and in Egypt, working on an initiative on engaging the private sector in serving the most impoverished populations, the populations in most need. And the question that I have for Romesh, but also the other panelists is, and you spoke about this a little bit, but to speak a little bit more specifically about initiatives that you have for public-private partnerships, but also for engaging the private sector, not just from a CSR perspective, but also from a strategic perspective.
And you had a question as well. You want to ask yours?
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Rita Moya with the M Fund, a very small social venture fund, and my question also is for Romesh. And I was pleased to hear you talk about human rights being one of the criteria that you look at. And for a small fund, that's a very big area to think that we could have any impact. The best you can do is try to gather some information. You want to know, what the corruption threats are in areas where you may be making investments. And I wondered if, and to all of you, could you kind of scale down your thinking to, investments, angel investments in social ventures of, $100,000, $200,000, where we're concerned about the just the climate, the civil society, where there's basic rule of law, and even when you visit places, it's very hard from someone that's not really schooled in those areas to understand those dynamics. I have been involved with Human Rights Watch, and that's been helpful from their country reports and the people that do those. But any other ideas you have would be very helpful. Thank you.
Don't underestimate the power of even small contributions. Romesh, why don't you start?
I think the best way for me to talk about in terms of the public-private is to give this example that the Secretary General has initiated on the sustainable energy for all, and I think that's a useful one. As most of you know, the SG has put this forward as part of the Rio initiatives too, is that to the target being 2030, that everybody around countries have energy, it's the sort of having access to energy in that context. And how he has engaged on this is that first he's engaged is that he's bringing in civil society and the philanthropic sector, the private sector, as well as governments together. So that's one angle in terms of the innovation in that context. The other, the whole leadership of it is again with the UN and the private sector. And he's bringing in the private sector to play a major role. And finally, the bottom line is it's rooted at the country level. Okay, and to give a good example is that in Nepal, we have been, UNDP has been working in Nepal, is that in terms of really helping in bringing about energy for about, I think, access to energy, and it's mini hydro sort of electricity access to about 1 million people. And it's done through a collaboration again of civil society, private sector, and the local government. So just to give you, this is an example that we would like to multiply this, okay? But it's something that, as we know, as all of you know, when you get the UN into the scene and to get the private sector involved, to get other actors involved, it takes time. It takes time for them to feel comfortable that you can work with this environment and it can work and here you are looking at a very small group in a village area. So it's not looking at a very national level. It was going to the sort of local level. In the context of your question, the best, and I would also ask my other colleagues, I'm sure they'll have answers. The best I can tell you, of course, with UNDP, we work in a certain sense in scale. But one of the things that we're trying to do, and I was in New Delhi for our regional meeting in Asia a couple of weeks ago, and and our office there asked us this thing, there are a lot of opportunities and wealthy people and foundations in India who want to get engaged and asking the UN to help them. And the biggest issue, the one big question was, in the US you have 501c3, okay, and you can get your tax deduction. And they were looking and saying, we don't have this in India. How can we help the companies? These foundations are willing to give money, and if you can help us through the federal government or at the central government level, can you help us to get them to understand there is money out there that can be invested by wealthy people, foundations, and companies, but they want a tax deduction. They want to be able to achieve that. So I'm saying is there is an opportunity if you take an organization like UNDP to help at the central government level to see if we can influence that change in regulatory environment or laws where that can help along the lines. The US has a good system. Other countries in Europe have a good system. So can we help them to sort of come up with a framework which then you will have access to from foundations, from wealthy individuals, etc. That's one solution I could think about. Over to you.
Nyaradzayi.
There are two questions, and I want to reflect on the time that I spent in Bellagio in answering one of the questions. I came back very much excited about the notion of well-being and innovation and how it links with both the need to focus on creative partnerships which upscales innovation. And for somebody who is coming from a civil society, a grassroots women's organization that has existed for 158 years, and where we are in 22,000 communities. There was a lot of discussion in Bellagio around scale, and which has come up severally, and looking at private-public sector partnership and scale. I said, if you look at the YWCA and you look at the YMCA, we are scale. We are real scale. And we are scale in the community, but also at multiple layers of engagement with government. And yet, the nature of development continues to look at the quality of relationship as a small project. So you get program funding, which is very small, very short term. And if we have to maximize scale, we have to shift the nature of trust. And I think that was also part of the critical discussion at Bellagio, that we need to look at how IFC, Rockefeller, the UN can trust community groups which have scale to say, you know, instead of a program of 50,000, Nyaradzayi, we can trust you with 3 million. Because the world has trusted us for 158 years and we have not died. So this is the contradictions that we face, that we talk about innovation, we talk about public-private sector partnership with communities, and yet when we sit across the table, the quality of the partnership does not match the possibilities of the potential that we have. And I think that is the next step, that is the leap, that if this centennial celebration could be launching what is the big idea. The big idea is to build a relationship of trust between the private sector, the non-profit sector, women and youth networks, and governments, and say we can do a collaborative initiative of a significant nature for which we can have tangible results, and we can put all the monitoring matrices around it, the accountabilities around it, the fiduciary monitoring aspects around it. So I think for me that is the first, because the tools of relationship are very complex. For us as the YWCA to access the IFC grant, I need a limb and a half. To be able to do, in terms of staff time, in terms of the complexity, and yet I think those are some of the shifts that has to happen, is the quality of reviewing the nature of the relationships without compromising accountability and without compromising quality deliverable, and with all of us having the eye on the goal. 25 million women, for which I'm a chief executive. That's the population of Rwanda, Swaziland, Lesotho, maybe 4 or 5 countries. I look at us as the women, when I was talking to Paul Pullman of Unilever, and I say, you know what, we can stop buying soap and the company can go under. Literally. So when we talk about the engagement with the private sector, it's important to understand who are the women in the private sector. We are number one consumers. We are the market. Because even if Baba, the man in the house, has to buy a car, hey, we have to talk, pa. We talk. So women are the market. And the power of women as the market, whether in financial services, in in service, the rest, I think we need to leverage that in terms of the social well-being and good. Women are entrepreneurs. Every day we are innovating to put food on the table. Innovating very creatively. I saw my mother innovate for the 11 of us, and I'm the baby, and she was a widow for 27 years. I saw her every day being creative around what food to put on the table and how. And we kind of forget that communities are creating knowledge every day for the well-being of their families and their communities. we don't capture that. We assume they're waiting. No, they're doing. We just need to reach them where they are in scale and say, my mother has a market garden. I do gardening every day now. I even know what herbs, what vegetables, medicinal, nutrition, everything. How do we link the indigenous knowledge in scale at the level where the people are? I think there's no trust. For me, there is no trust to invest in quality relationship which respects the knowledge that exists in communities. We are investors. Women are investing their time, their talent, their resources, investing as volunteers. So possibly when we made a pledge to the UN on Women and Children's Health Pledge, I was on the commission, the 40 billion has been pledged. I said, what can the women of the world pledge? We may not have the 40 billion. We pledged 5 billion hours in 5 years. 5 billion hours, if we were to quantify each hour of every woman who volunteers.
It's a lot of money.
How much is it? So I think we need, in the public-private sector partnership and engaging with communities, to reshape the narrative, to revalue contribution, and to use that to unleash the possibilities that exist. Because that, I think, is where the relationship lies. We've been having great conversations with Credit Suisse, for instance, as a potential partner. We've worked with Procter & Gamble. So in the YWCA, we've also had partnerships with the private sector, and would be keen to share much more practical conversations in terms of the where and the how. And lastly, this is a movement which is so daring in terms of investment. We have 5-star hotels, we have hostels, we have places you don't want to sleep because we don't even have a bed in that hostel. We have schools and community centers. So the YWCA is already an entrepreneurial organization. What we don't have sufficiently is to improve that on quality. Not quality of just of the services, but of the planning. So I think that is also where the potential lies of relationships, because our investments are more from a social provision point of view, other than also from looking at it from a market contribution point of view, and yet we are also contributing in terms of growth and income. And so I think these are some of the perspective, linking with some of the conversations at Bellagio in terms of how we can link community innovation with private sector engagement and with the multilateral in the foundations.
And I think you have a new opportunity now with the person coming in as the new president of the World Bank. As it was mentioned last night, of course, yesterday it was confirmed that Dr. Kim is coming in. He comes from Partners in Health. He has an understanding of those issues of trust and how do you scale nonprofit work. So it will be interesting to see. Every new president of the bank has their own, they want to make their mark in a new way. There may be an opportunity. I think we have time for just one more question. So, or maybe we can, let's fit 2 in and see, then we can get answers to the questions and final remarks from our 3 panelists.
My name is Angela Tafour. I'm the Executive Director of Give to Colombia. We advise international donors and local donors in trying to achieve high-impact projects in Colombia. In trying to achieve these high-impact projects, we understood the importance of having the government on board of our priorities and leveraging. But from our experience, on a pragmatic point of view, when the government comes in and matches our efforts, they're a complete hindrance. They don't understand our times, the way we're doing our impact, and sometimes it slows down our programs dramatically. So I wanted to ask you, what has been your experience from a pragmatic point of view of having that public-private partnership really effectively have the impact that you want? Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Monica Gary with the Bridge Fund, and we're a project of Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors. So we support programs across the Tibetan Plateau and the wider Himalaya. And we do collaborate in partnerships with a lot of local NGOs, very local. And we've brought on board, we've used private money to bring in USAID, Norway, and UNESCO and World Wildlife Fund. So we're firm believers in partnership. My question is, are there vehicles or platforms for some of the smaller foundations and donors to get involved in some of these amazing innovations that you're doing? Because it's wonderful, you hear about them, but there's so much capital to be unleashed, whether it's for grant making or impact investment, and how, we hear about collaboration, but where are those points of collaboration where people maybe at this forum could say, great, I have $25,000, I have $100,000, I'd love to participate in this because I know it's a strong initiative. And I just found this panel very inspiring, so thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so each of our panelists has about a minute and a half to wrap up and respond to these 2 points, if you like. The role of government, how can it be a supporter, not a hindrance, and what kind of platforms for smaller investors? Jennifer, you want to start?
Sure. I also want to follow up with you after to see if we can help you think about how you might be able to do investments in some of these harder to reach. We do a lot of work around investment climate, really working with the governments to try and create that enabling environment that enables potential investors to come in. In terms of government as a hindrance, I think the lesson that you learn inside something, an organization like the World Bank Group or like the UN is you can leave them behind or you can make that extra effort to bring them on board. And I think we see that a lot with communities too. It's much easier to come in and provide solutions than it is to listen to the solutions that are bubbling up from the bottom and then empower those solutions. And we talk a lot about capacity building. And I think certainly at IFC, when we think about technical assistance, there are clients and they have skin in the game as well, because increasingly our clients are making larger contributions to the assistance that we're providing. So they co-share a lot of the assistance, and that gives them that commitment. So it's always going to be a challenge to bring them on board, but I think the value of really working with governments and sustaining that relationship is that over time you have influence. And when you get a win around policy change, it's a really big win. So it's worth taking that time and bringing them on board. In terms of how you can get involved in smaller programs, I think there's huge value around catalytic funding. One of the things that people don't always understand in working with the World Bank Group, because it does seem hard to penetrate, is that we have very little flexible funding in the system. Everything that we have is very programmed. We don't tend to have small grants funds to really go out and try things. And often some of the work that we're doing is long-term, and it's not necessarily expensive, but bringing in other partners can have that effect of channeling others. And I'm thinking of one partnership that we're building right now around environmental and social performance metrics for financial institutions in Asia, and particularly in China. Imagine the impact you have on the environment when banks screen their portfolio for environmental and social metrics. It has a tremendous impact, and the conversation that we're having with the foundation is a $250,000 contribution to what's going to be a $6 million program. They understand, they get the value of doing this, and for us, it's a huge benefit to be able to go and say to other potential donors, look who we have on board. Because the non-traditional speaks, and for us, in our case, the non-traditional are impact investors, are funds, are foundations, and people listen because they say, wow, if that's a priority for them and they're willing to come on board, it makes a really significant difference. So I think we're here to help you navigate the system and uncover those opportunities. There are a lot of really interesting and innovative work that we're doing that is not about the dollar sign. The dollar sign comes later. It's really about the partnership and the willingness to get on board, and learn and potentially fail together, but to make sure that we have that relationship and we look at it over the long term.
Thanks, Jennifer. Romesh, final thoughts.
Just to say, to start with, I think, as part of the response to your question, in the subject of this discussion has been collaboration to manage comparative advantage. I think very clearly the train has left the station in terms that whether a UN system can work by itself or an IFC can work by itself is finished. Is that we have to collaborate. We need to work with partners, because any successful development solution is going to be the sum total of various actors. And that's the success of any development model you can think of. And whether you have a solution at the global level, at the regional level, at the national level, at the local level, it needs a multitude of actors. It needs governments, it needs multilateral institutions, bilaterals, it needs civil society, it needs private sector, it needs philanthropics, as well as subnational actors. So I may have missed some other partners in that sort of group, but every solution needs a number of actors into it. And it depends on what you're trying to, what your intervention is. The expertise that you will require will come from one of them. So if I were to ask, if I was to say the part that you said, how do you support governments? If I take an organization like UNDP, we should be, and we are doing it, in terms of influencing and helping national governments to understand that solutions, development solutions, do not happen just by their own interventions. They need to encourage other actors within the country. They need to create that legal and environment and those regulatory environment that encourages others to come up and support. So an organization like UNDP can support from a central level and help to influence that change. The bank can help in that context. And in terms of, if I looked at the other part of it, you were talking about what are some of the new vehicles for smaller foundations. I would say, again, of course, there's a lot of social investing going on. There are a lot of social investment funds that have moved in that direction. Again, I think for an organization like UNDP, again, is to create the climate. And that's where we all need to create that climate and get governments to understand at the local level that solutions require, again, I come back being repetitive, is that requires a number of different actors. And each actor needs a framework and needs that encouragement that they don't feel it's a hindrance to do that type of support. I just want to conclude by just saying, I think Heather brought it up in the beginning. My colleague Sigrid Karg would have loved to have been here. She was sort of pulled up by our administrator to be at another meeting with her. So unfortunately she couldn't make it, and I'm sure she would have, just to tell you that she also asked me to give her regrets.
Thank you
very much.
Nyaradzayi, you're all that's standing between these good people and lunch. Final thoughts, very briefly.
I have two final thoughts which combine the two questions and the earlier one on human rights. I think in whatever relationship that you wish to engage, from our experience through the World YWCA Power to Change Fund, we always say it's important to look into the collaborative partnership and say, are you contributing to catalyze? Are you leveraging? Are you seeking to scale up, to innovate, to engage, or to support a convening? And for us always, it's very clear that we remain very grounded on for what. And for us, it's always about the dignity, the rights, and the potential. Because we need always to leverage the rights, the dignity, and the potential of the individual in whatever level. The last, my last comment, Heather, I go back a little bit stronger, because I spend my day and my life in the trenches of the very extreme. I go back a little bit more confident that people care for each other, that the world cares. Whatever you do in whatever sector you're doing it, just do it. You may never meet these people that we're talking about. You may never know their names, but know always that you're making a difference. Always. It might not be today, but tomorrow. It might not be in your own village, but maybe in the other person's village. I just wanted to say, I go back a little bit stronger, knowing that humanity cares. So,
Thank you.
Thank
That's
you.
a beautiful sentence to end on. Thank you all for coming. Let's give our panelists a hand.